Paradox Development Studios has had massive success with its historical strategy games in the recent decade, and gone from being essentially an indie developer to becoming one of the largest players in the genre. And that's actually a gigantic achievement when the main gameplay at first seems to be something like this, but behind its mechanics and surface, we of course find something much more akin to this. Massive successes like EU4, Hearts of Iron, and Crusader Kings 3 have solidified Paradox as perhaps the most dedicated historical developer with devotion to deep and immersive mechanics. And even when they go outside of history, like with their sci-fi game Stellaris, they do an amazing job, especially over time. The proof really is in the pudding too, and when taking a look at the game's player numbers, you'll see that all of these games have an impressive amount of daily and returning players, even for titles that are now between 5 and 9 years old. Just take a look at the numbers. During the time of recording, both EU4 and Hearts of Iron 4 have managed to retain a daily number of players that is almost or more than half of their all-time peak. But even Stellaris, a very different game, has an average daily player number of around 16,000. Let's now compare them to Total War games from around the same years. Rome 2 came out in 2013, the same year as EU4. But Rome 2, even though it's Creative Assembly's most popular historical strategy game to date, retains only around 6,000 daily players, or about 1/20th of its all-time peak. Attila, arguably CA's best game coming out 1 year before Hearts of Iron 4, only retains about 2,000 to 3,000 players. Warhammer 1, which actually came out just 2 weeks before Hearts of Iron 4, has a daily player base of around 800. Now if we are extremely nice, we could say that each Warhammer game kind of transplants the last. Well, right now, Warhammer 2 has about 9,000 daily players, and the latest game, flying on massive hype, which you can tell by this number, holds on to about 14,000. But as you can see, both of these numbers are so far away from their all-time peaks. Yes, perhaps a lot of people are waiting for more patches or the Mortal Empires campaign, but therein also lies my point. And before we move on, I just want to say a massive thank you to my patrons, who mean so much to me and this channel. If you enjoy what I do as well, I really hope you'll consider becoming a channel member or support me on Patreon, as every donation means the world to me. And now, why Total War needs another masterpiece, and how we can get there. Total War has for most of my strategy-loving life defined what a good and epic historical strategy game should be, and that's of course thanks to the minds over at Creative Assembly, who offer unique and massive strategy experiences. I mean, who could see this and not think that Total War is something truly special? But in recent years, historical strategy games, especially of the kind we're used to, have become less of a Total War priority. The reality of the matter is that fans of historical and realistic Total War games haven't really gotten a new mainline game since 2015. And even then, many of the releases have been either disappointing or lackluster in one way or another. Instead, fantasy or supernatural inspired games like the Warhammer series, 3K, and Troy have dominated. And even though there are many good things to say about these games, it is something of an objective fact that the vibe of these later games are vastly different from the vibe of the pre-Warhammer 1 era titles. In fact, Total War is almost unrecognizable in terms of vibe and overall target audience and game feel, and I think this is a big mistake for CA's long-term goals of actually retaining players. I believe Total War needs a new masterpiece release title in the historical genre to really reinvigorate the community. In this video then, I'm going to outline 6 different ways Total War can return to greatness and recapture the magic of old. And even though this video is mostly aimed at how they can get back to historical players, these points will also be of value to fantasy fans. And so let's cut straight to the chase, shall we? Number 1. Total War needs to be unafraid of sequels. It might sound weird considering the fact that we've gotten 3 Warhammer titles in the scope of 6 years, but that is actually unprecedented in Total War history. Think of any of the installments in the historical Total War series, and we have no 3rd installment at all. The most we have is a Medieval 2, a Rome 2, and a Shogun 2, despite all of these number 2s now being between 9 and 16 years old. And even though this likely was a team decision, we can attribute this line of thought partially to Mike Simpson, who said on numerous occasions that CA had no real appetite for 30 installments. But this is of course kind of sussy, since the moment they could, CA made 3 games in the same series in record time, and in a series that none of the historical fans had asked for a 3rd installment in. All props to CA for stepping out of their comfort zone and doing that, but I believe it's time for the traditional fans to get their due as well. We want a Medieval 3, we want an Empire 2, and we want a Rome 3, and yes, we want a Shogun 3 as well. Of course, other time periods and scenarios would be interesting as well, but Total War covered these time periods in the past specifically because they are so vast and all-encompassing, and literally every historical Total War fan I've ever talked to has wanted a new game in either of these series. So come on CA, if Paradox can make 4 EU games, 4 Hearts of Iron games, 3 Crusader Kings games, and now 3 Victoria games, which the fans are ecstatic by, then you can do so as well. Uncannily, you have just as many series as they do, and Total War fans want new games in the periods they love just as much as Paradox fans do. Number 2. Increased depth and immersion. I am a big campaign player, as I imagine the vast majority of Total War players to be. The campaign ties the battles together and gives us something more to invest in and fight for. Paradox games focuses entirely on their campaigns and is all the better for it. But Total War has this unique dual system of turn-based campaigns and real-time battles, and I know that's exactly why the series has become so integral to me. But I have to admit that much of what made the Total War campaign so intriguing is gone or diminished, and this development needs to be stopped and reversed. What made Total War campaign so immersive were all the little details that came together and made a vastly better whole. Population systems with actual population numbers, impactful seasons, trade lanes from every port, road building where you, the player, got to change the look of the map itself, naval battles, detailed ledgers of public order, taxes, cultures, religions, trade, and other income, being able to place down watchtowers and forts to actually change the tactical and strategic layout of the campaign map, governors, and fertility. There are so many cool mechanics we used to have in these games that are all now but gone. This is partly why I find Warhammer campaigns so unimmersive despite the unique faction mechanics, exactly because the integral state mechanics are lacking. And rather than feeling like I'm leading an empire, I'm made to feel like I'm leading a culture, and the difference there is vast. But this goes beyond the big mechanics when we're talking about immersion. Heading over to the battle maps, I sincerely miss those good old Medieval 2 custom animations, despite them being 16 years old. Remember when units actually pushed battering rams, or when the entire crew had animations for when loading or shooting cannons? There are so many little things just like this that it is mind-boggling that doesn't exist in modern titles, where these things just magically move forward by themselves. So CA, please understand why your games were so cool to begin with, and it really comes down to all of these details the player will encounter time and time again. To your defense, I know you still have the skills to do this. I mean, you managed to make dragons and giants and disgusting Nurgle creatures now, so it's definitely not from a lack of skill. Instead, I think it comes down to priorities. And in my opinion, making immersive animations for your normal units is what will be beneficial in the long run, because this is what the player will experience time and time again. But we can't even use Warhammer as an excuse here, as the same issue of magically moving siege weapons is present in Rome 2 as well. So again, this needs to be prioritized. I'm unironically kind of sick of going back to decades old games to find what I'm looking for. And it's a bit sad, frankly, to know that the series I love hasn't really catered to fans like me in more than half a decade. It honestly feels like Attila was the last Total War game, and that's something I, who's been here since 2005, should not be feeling when the series is making more money than it ever has before. Number 3. A diplomacy for the future. Total War desperately needs a new diplomacy paradigm. We cannot have the AI's actions being determined by nothing more than relations or mood swings from turn to turn. Total War AI just isn't good enough to be unrestricted like this. Instead, Total War needs to adopt a rules-based diplomatic system where certain actions are either unavailable or will be severely punished depending on the situation. Say you just agreed to trade rights with a new partner, declared peace with an enemy, or just became an overlord or a vassal. It should not be possible to declare war on an enemy the next turn or even in the next 10 turns, at least not without incurring some heavy internal and external penalties for the attacker. This will make it so that vassal relationships don't just turn into relationship of convenience where the vassal may break the relationship whenever they wish, and that the player isn't backstabbed by a good friend for no apparent reason. We also need other factors implemented, such as distant factors or perhaps even casus belli. The former will make it so that you're not randomly attacked by distant factions just because you're the player, and the latter could make war a bit more calculated and determined. Nations in history would, for example, know whether a neighbor wanted their land for whatever reason, be it culturally or by royal succession claims, and I believe it's time for Total War to include casus belli claims in some way, however minor, both determining which provinces the AI covets, and making diplomacy and warfare more reliable and even historical in nature. This could even be a setting in the game, so if you wanted it as random and nonsensical as it is right now, you could turn these rules off. Number 4. Expanded horizons. Polish, new engine, or whatever. Total War games need to ship in okay states. Anything else is just unacceptable. And yet, it happens time and time again. Empire Total War shipped in a laughable state, Rome 2 was even worse, and now, Warhammer 3 has upset a large portion of the fanbase as well, despite running on the same engine as Warhammer 2. Unless we're talking smaller titles like Napoleon, Fall of the Samurai, or Troy, it's sadly a pattern for these games to ship in a mostly unfinished state, and sometimes even completely broken. It is therefore imperative that CA spends more time on their games before release, or perhaps find another way to approach them. But what's so strange about the Total War games is that they run so differently depending on the games, even though they use essentially the same engine. Attila runs much worse than Rome 2, but Warhammer 1 runs better than Attila. Warhammer 3 looks almost identical to Troy, and yet Troy is the best running game in the franchise, despite also being the best looking one in my opinion. These are facts I cannot reconcile, and because performance is so vital to a good gaming experience, a polishing of the release engine needs to be one of the top priorities. If you've been a Total War gamer for some time already, you've likely heard of the notorious Warscape engine, which is generally used as the scapegoat for every Total War fault. The reason for this is that after Medieval 2, Creative Assembly revamped their engine to largely fit the long-range warfare of Empire. Warscape has indeed been in use since 2009, only changing from 32-bit to 64-bit with Warhammer. Even though I believe CA has proven that a lot can change within the same engine, I believe it's time for them to really take a good look at what they're doing here. Because when going back to the 2006 Medieval 2, it's still the place where you'll get some of the best combat experiences in terms of animations and unit collision, where the battles just flow so well. I think perhaps CA need to come up with some entirely new engine altogether, or at least overhaul the current one to create some sort of paradigm shift. There are engines out there, like the one in Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator 2, that promises an enormous amount of units on screen at once with minimal lag. I mean, just look at this stuff, it's actually insane. Obviously this may not translate one-to-one, but with technology like this, we could have actually massive battlefields and realistic looking cities that are large and varied. Imagine those Empire battles with tens of thousands of muskets and cannons firing, or those epic Roman era battles. It's been essentially 2 decades, yet my Total War battles remained about the same size as they did back in 2005, ranging between 500 to 6,000 units in a battle at once, and I know that the latter will indeed become a lag fest despite my beefy PC specs. A new engine for Total War that could accommodate both better animations and much larger armies would be a true paradigm shift that the series is in dire need of. And then we're not even talking about graphics. But honestly, here's the weird thing about graphics in Total War. Somehow, I kind of feel like the visuals peaked in either Napoleon or Rome 2. Just look at these visuals from Napoleon, the soft and immersive looking campaign map, the lighting in the water, or on the battlefields, where the flags actually look semi-realistic and actually move depending on movement and wind. Or what about Rome 2, where with just a tiny reshade change, the game looks like this, arguably the most gorgeous map in the series. Somehow, Warhammer 3 doesn't give me that same immersive experience, despite perhaps having better particle effects and demanding so much more from my PC. What I'm saying is that Total War has already reached a level of visual detail that is more than acceptable, and further improvements to any engine in terms of visuals should instead go towards increasing performance, playability, and focus on unique approaches to visuals rather than sheer raw visual power. Number 5. Music. This is a surprisingly major point of mine, as music and soundtrack really is the thing that encapsulates the sensation of a game and ties it all together. One of the reasons why I love Rome, Rome 2, Medieval 2, and Napoleon is because the music in those games were fantastic. In my opinion, Rome and Medieval 2 had amazing campaign and battle tracks, while Rome 2 and Napoleon excelled in the campaign music. But since Attila, Total War soundtracks have focused a lot more on ambient tracks that are reserved to the background, and sadly this goes for the battle music as well, which has almost none of the memorable tracks you'll return to decades later. These soundtracks sound a lot more like generic tunes these days, and this might be to a musical style or restriction put on the composers rather than their actual skills. Nevertheless, both Total War and every other strategy game rely on soundtracks that make the player feel something, and that has in my opinion been lacking for many years now. Number 6. Modability. Let me ask you something. Why do you still return to Medieval 2? Your answer will probably be because of mods. Medieval 2 was the last Total War game that allowed modders to truly change things up completely, and the same goes for the recently released Rome Remastered. Now, a common argument, or at least an imagined fear of the developers, is that mods will dissuade players from buying new titles if they can just mod them into the prior games. That's fair in theory, but let me say this. I don't think anyone decided to not buy Medieval 2 because there's a medieval mod for Rome. I don't think anyone would think to not buy a future Medieval 3 because of MK1212 for Attila. And yes, I mentioned MK1212 despite Attila being a so-called unmoddable game. But listen, modders work hard to crack and unlock various parts of the game's files, and a mod like MK1212 is in a great state right now, 7 years after the game's release. Compared to Crusader Kings 3 from Paradox, which within the first 1 to 2 years has a fully functioning Lord of the Rings total conversion mod, which I bet would not make anyone not buy a fully licensed Paradox Lord of the Rings title. Both Paradox and Bethesda has understood that modding is the lifeblood of a game's longevity, and Total War needs to both catch up and return to their roots in this regard. Total War needs a new masterpiece to really reinvigorate its player base and frankly its own game series. It's been so long since I've been genuinely amazed by a Total War game that it's rather depressing, and instead of going into deeper territory, it's been feeling like it's doing the opposite, focusing more on arcadey action and surface elements. I believe the points in this video outlines a better vision for Total War games, and I hope you'll agree with me. Those were my tips to Creative Assembly and the Total War series, and how a new masterpiece game can be achieved. I absolutely love these games and admire CA for their devotion to their own genre, as you can tell from my video catalog on this very channel. I have more hours in these games than most other titles out there, and remain hopeful for the future of this series after Warhammer. But as a historical fan, I have to admit that I feel neglected. I do want my historical series back. I want them polished from day one. I want a second or third installment in all of them, and see new scenarios and campaigns I've never seen before with the mechanics of old and completely new ones. I know Creative Assembly are indeed creative because they managed to make the Warhammer series, which I guarantee you takes a lot more mental, programming, and coding gymnastics than taking the historical titles into deeper and more immersive Paradox-like territory. Thank you so much for watching. Even though I absolutely love Paradox games, very little managed to actually beat the battles of historical Total War games that feel tactical and epic. If you have an opinion on my suggestions, or indeed have some of your own, let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, I really hope you leave a like and consider supporting the channel by either becoming a channel member or a patron. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.